Ready for an adventure?
We're going deep into the heart of Java.
Not the Java you see on postcards, though.
The Java of centuries past.
And our guide.
Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles.
Ah, a fantastic choice.
With his book, The History of Java.
This isn't just any history book.
Raffles, he was lieutenant governor.
During the British rule of Java.
Early 1800s.
So first-hand perspective.
Yes!
On Javanese history.
Pivotal moment.
Okay, so...
Time machines fueled up.
Guides by our side?
First stop on this deep dive.
Well, one of the most fascinating things...
about Raffles' account.
...is how he challenges...
the common perception.
...of Java as solely Islamic.
Oh, interesting.
He takes us back.
To a time before Islam's dominance.
Revealing a Java.
Deeply intertwined with Hindu traditions.
You mean like those stunning temples...
exactly.
...you see in pictures.
Raffles describes these temples.
With incredible detail.
Take Chandi Suwu, for example.
He describes this massive complex.
A central pyramid.
Surrounded by rings of smaller temples.
Wow.
All intricately carved.
Full of symbolism.
It's easy to imagine.
Ancient rituals.
Ceremonies taking place there.
Sounds like.
Something straight out of Indiana Jones.
Right.
And what's even more interesting...
is how the Javanese interpreted Hinduism...
in their own...
unique way.
So they didn't just...
adopted wholesale from India.
They did not.
They blended it.
With their own existing belief.
And practices.
Our Java had...
its own distinct flavor of Hinduism.
Precisely.
For example.
They placed a greater emphasis on Brahma.
Which wasn't as common.
In other parts of India.
This highlights how...
religions are constantly evolving.
it's not static.
It's dynamic.
Adapting as they travel.
Interact with different cultures.
A process of cultural exchange and interpretation.
That's a really important takeaway.
How even seemingly rigid systems...
like religion.
are actually constantly in flux.
Yes.
Shaped by the people and places they encounter.
Exactly.
And this cultural blending...
it's a recurring theme.
throughout Javanese history.
It is.
As we move into the Majapahit Empire.
We see this in the political landscape as well.
We do.
The Majapahit Empire.
Yeah, that's a name.
That sparks intrigue.
I remember reading about their legendary founding.
Full of power struggles and heroic figures.
Raffles.
He certainly doesn't shy away from those tales.
He recounts the story of Chiang Wanara,
A cunning figure.
who outsmarted his brother to gain land.
And eventually establish the Majapahit dynasty.
It's like
Something out of Shakespeare.
But even if these stories
Are embellished or mythologized.
they tell us a lot.
About how the Javanese understood their own history.
Absolutely.
And the forces at play.
In shaping their world,
These stories were their way.
of making sense of the past,
Of explaining.
the rise and fall of empires,
And of celebrating.
the heroes and villains.
Who shaped their destiny.
And what's really striking is
All of
the
them.
Hindu temples.
The rise of Majapahit.
These epic power struggles.
It all happened before European influence.
That's a crucial point.
Became the dominant force in Java.
We often think of colonial history,
As the starting point for many cultures.
but Java had a rich and complex history.
Long before the Dutch arrived.
So they had their own
Internal dynamics.
power struggles, their own
Right.
cultural tapestry.
They did.
It's more accurate to say,
That the Dutch inserted themselves.
into an already complex situation
Precisely.
rather than arriving on a blank slate,
Understanding this pre-colonial history.
is essential to understand.
How the Dutch eventually came to wield so much influence.
Well, since you mentioned the Dutch
Let's talk about their arrival.
and the eventual fall of the Majapahit Empire,
What does Raffles have to say about that?
one of the most interesting things
About Raffles' account.
is how he describes the arrival of Islam.
It wasn't a sudden conquest,
Oh,
as is often depicted.
but a gradual process.
Driven by traders and missionaries.
So more of a slow burn
Exactly.
than an explosion.
He tells the story of the Raja of Cherman.
Who converted to Islam.
And later visited Majapahit peacefully.
It challenges the often violent image.
Of religious conversion.
It's a reminder that
History is rarely black and white.
it is,
There are often nuances.
and complexities that get lost.
In simplistic narratives.
Precisely.
And the fall of Majapahit.
Is a prime example of that.
Yes.
Raffles explores the various accounts.
Of its collapse.
And there's no...
Single definitive story.
Right.
Some say the king fled.
Others that he was killed.
It's a bit of a historical mystery.
It is.
So what does that tell us?
About history itself.
It reminds us that history
is often a collection of interpretations.
not just a set of objective facts.
Yes.
It's shaped by
It's who's telling the story.
what their motivations are.
What details they choose.
To emphasize or omit.
That's a really important thing to keep in mind.
especially when we're dealing with accounts from centuries ago.
Absolutely.
And as we delve deeper
Into the rise of the Mataram Sultanate,
and the growing influence of the Dutch,
this critical lens.
becomes even more important.
It does.
We have to remember.
That we're seeing things through Raffles's eyes,
Yes.
and his perspective
Well, valuable.
is just one among many.
It is.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle.
And Raffles' account,
Is just one piece.
albeit a fascinating and detailed one.
Exactly.
And as we continue our deep dive,
We'll start to uncover more pieces of that puzzle,
well, we will,
revealing a more complete picture.
of this complex and fascinating period in Javanese history.
We will,
So are you ready?
to venture deeper into the world of the Mataram Sultanate
Absolutely.
Raffles account.
Really brings this period to life.
We're not just talking about names and dates anymore,
No.
but about real people,
Driven by.
the same ambitions and passions as us.
Exactly.
He gives us this almost Shakespearean,
Glimpse into court life.
filled with intrigue,
Betrayal.
power play,
Yeah, it makes you realize.
that human nature hasn't changed much over the centuries.
Not at all.
And one incident
That really brings this home.
is the story of the Susahunan
The ruler of Mataram.
and his reaction to a letter from the ruler of Nusa Antara.
A neighboring island.
Okay.
Raffles says he was so enraged
By the letters contest.
that he grabbed the messenger,
He did.
choked him,
Oh my.
tore the letter to shreds.
And threw the pieces in the poor guy's face.
Talk about.
A dramatic delivery receipt
Right.
makes email sound pretty tame in comparison.
It certainly shows the volatile nature,
Of power and diplomacy?
even back then.
Yeah.
And this tension
Is something we see.
throughout the Mataram Sultanate's history
As various factions jostled
for power and influence.
on, of course,
The Dutch were never too far away
when there was an opportunity,
to exploit those rivalries.
catching on quickly
The Dutch were masters
at using these internal conflicts.
to their advantage.
A prime example is
The conflict
between Amonkharat I
and his son, Trunajaya.
Right.
This is where things get really messy, right?
I vaguely remember.
Reading about a rebellion.
Exactly.
Trunajaya rebelled against his father,
And sought support from the Makasaris.
who were rivals of the Dutch.
So the Dutch,
Seeing an opportunity to weaken,
the Mataram Sultanate,
the Dutch sided with Amonkharat.
it's like a tangled web.
Of alliances and betrayals.
Yeah, and I'm guessing.
Things didn't end well.
You're right to be skeptical.
While the Dutch intervention,
Helped Amonkharat initially.
it came at a steep price.
What do you mean?
They used their support to extract concessions
Gain territory?
and further entrench themselves.
In Javanese affairs?
It's a classic example.
Of how seemingly helpful interventions
Can quickly morph.
into something more insidious.
Right.
Their support always seemed to come.
With strings attached.
Strings that eventually entangled.
The whole of Javanese society
And this control.
wasn't just limited to political maneuvering.
What else?
The Dutch were also obsessed with regulating and profiting from every aspect.
Of Japanese life.
So they controlled their trade as well.
Including trade.
This is where those
Well, there's
disputes
ways.
come in.
Clummings. Right.
Exactly.
I remember you mentioning them earlier.
Raffles devotes a whole section
To the Dutch East India Company's attempts.
to control the value of kobangs,
So they,
which were widely used in trade,
they tried to manipulate the exchange rate,
for their own benefit.
of course.
But the Japanese
Lever traders that they were.
introduced new types of kobangs,
They wouldn't just
throwing a wrench.
into the Dutch plans.
So even back then,
You couldn't just rig the system
precisely,
and expect everyone to play along.
it's a great example of how
Attempts to control complex systems like global trade,
often backfire.
even for powerful entities, like the Dutch East India Company.
It's a good reminder that
Economics and power,
have always been,
closely intertwined.
yes,
But I'm also curious.
about the lives of everyday Javanese people during this time.
Did Raffles offer any insights?
He did.
And it's a side of history.
We don't always get to see.
What did he say?
Raffles talks about
The different social classes in Japanese society?
from farmers and traders to slaves.
Wow.
He even describes a practice.
Called debt slavery,
What's that?
where people were forced into servitude.
To repay debts.
It sounds like a system.
Ripe for exploitation.
Sadly, it often was.
It trapped people
In a cycle of poverty
and highlighted the stark inequality.
that existed within Javanese society.
Inequalities
Inequalities that the Dutch often exploited.
for their own gain.
It's a reminder that
Even in the midst.
of these grand historical narratives,
Real people were just trying to live their lives
Navigate the system.
and hold on to their culture and beliefs.
Exactly.
And speaking of culture and beliefs,
Raffles provides fascinating insights.
into Javanese folklore and religious practices,
He does.
he talks about their tales of gods and demons
Their ancestral spirits.
and their own unique interpretation of the Ramayana.
Right.
It's fascinating how every culture,
Has its own way of making sense of the world.
its own stories and myths
Yes.
that shape their understanding.
Of life, death, and everything in between.
And these stories weren't just for entertainment.
Well,
It served as a way
to transmit values.
to explain the unexplainable
And provide a sense of identity and belonging.
in a world that was rapidly changing around them.
It makes you wonder,
How those stories must have evolved.
as the Dutch presence grew stronger,
Right.
did they adapt their narratives?
That's a great question.
That's something we see throughout history.
Cultures adapting
And reinterpreting their own narratives.
in response to external forces
It's easy to get caught up
in these grand narratives.
of empires and colonialism.
It is
Mhm.
hearing about those stories and beliefs
Reminds us.
that there's a human face to history.
Absolutely.
And as the Dutch presence in Java intensified,
Those human faces.
become impossible to ignore.
What do you mean?
We see surge,
And rebellions.
uprisings throughout Java,
It's where
the tensions we've been discussing.
boil over, right?
Right.
It's one thing.
To accept a gradual shift in power,
But another,
to stand by.
as your way of life is dismantled.
Precisely.
And Raffles does a great job.
Of illustrating that.
These weren't isolated incidents,
So was it just...
driven by a few disgruntled individuals
This was a wave of resistance.
against systematic oppression.
Exploitation.
So who are some
Of the key figures.
in this wave of resistance?
One name that looms large.
Is Surapati.
Okay.
He was a Balinese prince
Who was captured
by the Mataram Sultanate.
and later escaped.
Wow.
He rallied a force
Of disgruntled Javanese,
challenging both.
the Mataram rulers.
And the Dutch,
He sounds like
a real-life action hero,
right.
fighting for those
Who couldn't fight for themselves.
become a powerful symbol of resistance
His rebellion lasted for years, highlighting the depth of resentment
towards both the Mataram rulers
and the increasingly intrusive Dutch East India Company.
His story really underscores that.
Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds
People will fight
of their freedom.
and their right to self-determination.
And it forced the Dutch to confront the reality.
That controlling Java
Wouldn't be a simple matter.
of exerting their military might.
They couldn't just...
They couldn't just assume control without consequence.
These rebellions were costly.
Disrupt
Forced them to constantly adapt.
their strategies.
It's almost as if
Those in power,
often underestimate the will of the people.
they seek to control.
You're exactly right.
And Raffles details another rebellion.
This time led by
A Javanese nobleman.
named Mantri.
Okay.
He opposed the Adipatipati,
The Dutch-appointed governor of Semarang.
who is widely seen as...
Corrupt and abusive.
So in this case...
It wasn't just about resisting the Dutch,
but also about challenging...
the local power structures.
that had been co-opted.
Precisely.
John-Free's rebellion
Though ultimately unsuccessful.
demonstrates the multifaceted nature of resistance.
How so?
It wasn't always a direct confrontation
But a constant pushback
against injustice and exploitation.
wherever it was found.
It's a stark reminder.
That the fight for freedom,
Is rarely straightforward,
it often involves
navigating
internal divisions
and the ever-present threat.
of those in power.
Sadly,
That is a recurring theme.
throughout history,
How so?
the Dutch were masters,
Of divide and conquer.
often pitting different Javanese groups against each other.
To maintain their own dominance.
That's the truly tragic element of colonialism,
It's not just the imposition of external control.
but the way it fractures,
And weakens existing structures.
making true liberation even more difficult.
You've hit on a crucial point.
The legacy of colonialism
Extends far beyond the physical presence of the colonizers. It leaves behind invisible scars.
on the social and political fabric of a nation.
So where does Raffles leave us?
At the end of his account,
Does he offer any glimmer of hope
he does,
amidst all this turmoil?
while acknowledging the grim realities of Dutch colonialism.
He also highlights
Their incredible resilience.
of the Javanese people.
What does he say?
He talks about
Their enduring spirit,
strong sense of
a
community
deep connection.
to their land, traditions, and stories
It's a testament to the power of culture.
to provide solace and strength.
Even in the darkest of times. That's a powerful image to end on.
The idea that
even under the weight of oppression,
the human spirit finds ways.
to endure and resist.
And it's a crucial reminder.
As you continue to explore Javanese history,
That Raffles account
while valuable,
represents just one perspective.
you're right.
It's like we've been looking at a tapestry.
From one angle,
And while we've uncovered incredible detail,
and artistry,
there's a whole other side.
waiting to be explored.
Exact.
Seek out Javanese voices,
Delve into their oral traditions.
and see how their own narratives
Might differ from.
or even challenge Raffles' account.
It's about understanding that.
History is never a single story. It's a chorus of voices, experiences, and interpretations.
Precisely.
And the more of those voices we listen to,
The richer and more nuanced.
of our understanding of the past becomes
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
into Javanese history.
what's the most important thing?
You want our listener to take away
I think the most important thing
to approach history.
with a critical but empathetic eye.
Question the narratives you encounter,
Seek out alternative perspectives
and never lose sight
of the human stories.
that shape the grand sweep of events.
Beautifully put. History isn't just about,
Memorizing dates and names
it's about understanding the forces
that have shaped our world
and using that knowledge
to navigate
the present and future.
with greater wisdom and compassion.
Until next time.
Keep exploring. Keep questioning.
And keep diving deep.